Now we're recording. All right. Welcome back. Good to see everybody. I'll start the sign-in sheet here, as always. So, sorry about Tuesday. It's been one of those semesters. It's hard to get in the groove. Suffice it to say, jury duty was not fun. Highly unrecommended, but you have to go to these things. You know how it goes. So I've done some different things in Canvas for us, and I've posted the first exam. Hopefully you saw the announcement. It's out there. You can take a look at it. No surprises. Stuff we've talked about and can continue to talk about today if need be. The due date, I think I made it next Friday, which seems like to me it should be enough time for 2 essay questions. As far as the length requirement, again, it's hard to give a specific number. I mean, it just as long as you answer the question completely and be sure to not take anything for granted. So in other words, just because we've talked about it in class and you think you understand it, part of the purpose of us doing this is for you to explain it to me as if, I'm somebody who doesn't know what you're already talking about. So keep that in mind. A better answer is one that includes a little more rather than a little bit less, but I'm thinking somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 3 pages roughly for each of those questions should be enough, I think. Also, the latest discussion board is out there, kind of trying to get the flow right here since we've had some gaps in the schedule, but we're not too far off, and I have budgeted extra time into the schedule for just these sorts of things. So, questions from you guys before we do some more epistemology? Yeah, thanks. Probably double-spaced is easier for me to read. Yeah, I mean, whichever, I can do it either way, but I think double-spaced is a better way to go. And again, all the usual kind of caveats. I mean, if you have questions, the safest thing to do is either see me before, after class. If you can't make office hours, set up an appointment time, shoot me an email. Get your questions answered, but the usual kinds of things that you would have to take care of in writing a paper, they're going to apply here. So shouldn't have to do any outside research or anything like that. Everything you need to write a good answer is in Feldman, essentially what we're going through already. Anthony?
So for the next discussion,
yeah.
chapters
Right. Yeah. So I think I had it about foundationalism and coherentism, right? So yeah, I think it's better to focus in on some, try to narrow it down if you can, because you're right, this is a long chapter, and it's going to take us 2 or 3, maybe 4 meetings probably to really do justice to it and get through it, because there's a lot of stuff in there. And as always, I'm not really inclined to race through things that I know people are confused about. There's people of lots of different varying backgrounds and degrees of philosophical experience here, so I want to kind of keep that in mind, right, as we're going through it. But yeah, if you want to pick one particular aspect of any of those 2 theories, or if you don't like either of them, there's there's that idea to write about. There's some hybrid theories that are out there as well. So good question. Yeah. Other stuff? Alrighty. Well, so last time, it's been a long time, but last time we were working our way through chapter 3, right? The Gettier problem. And we looked at several different examples of the Gettier problem, and then started talking about initially 2 ways of trying to save the traditional analysis, right? So you guys helped me out a little bit here. My voice is better, but it's not 100%. So contributions are appreciated. So what's one, if you're going to try to keep the traditional analysis, right, which is, again, somebody remind us here. We've got S knows that P, if and only if, what's the first one? Yep, the truth condition, P is true. Second one? Yeah. S believes P. The third one? Thanks, Jamie. Yeah. S is justified in believing P. And again, I apologize for my terrible handwriting here. If you can't make it out, raise your hand, and I'll try to help you. So this is the JTB analysis. Feldman calls it the TAK, right? Traditional analysis of knowledge. And that's where we kind of were at the end of chapter 2. And then Gettier comes along, right, in his short paper, which, again, I encourage you to take a look at it. It's not easy going, but it's very short. It's only 2.5 pages long. And he presents 2 counterexamples there, and the ones that Feldman discusses in the beginning of chapter 3, right? The sheep in the field and the no-got case and the 10 coins case are all kind of variations on the basic idea that Gettier had an insight into, right? And so somebody just, without having to go back and reread them, because depending on how far we get, we might be reading some other examples today, but somebody give me an example, or if you want to come up with one of your own, that's fine, of what the problem is with this, what's wrong with JTB. Let's see if we can get a Gettier example. It can be one that we've talked about, if you remember one. Always a good exercise to see if you can sort of walk us through these things, right? So how about my clock example? Anybody want to describe that one? How's it work? Yeah, I think so.
Well, the idea is that if there's a clock that's not working, somebody looks at it, they're still justified in believing that it's the right time, and they look at it at the time that happens to be the right time,
Yep.
so they know it. If you know it, you're justified in believing it, and it satisfies all 3 components of the JTB. But we would say that they don't actually know it because the clock is broken. It's like a false proposition that they claim to know it, or is there some gray
Yeah.
area?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. Yeah, that's. I know this is hard stuff to do, and I mean, the only way you can get good at it is by just taking the risk and doing it, right? You got to try. So I appreciate that. Thanks. So yeah, so in the clock example, which wasn't one that Feldman discussed, and if you want to get real picky, there are some differences between that and the Feldman style cases, but you get the basic idea, right? You look at the clock, and it appears to you to say that it's a certain time, right? And so it is that time, let's suppose, and you believe that it's that time, and you're justified in believing it's that time, because I mean, after all, you're looking at the clock on the wall, and in general background assumptions and so on. That in everyday experience, that would be sufficient to justify your belief in its being in that time. And so it looks like you satisfy all 3 of the conditions of JTB, and if this analysis were correct, then that would mean that you know what time it is. But then when you add the little extra part about the clock having broken, let's say 2 weeks ago at exactly that time, and here you are 2 weeks later looking at it, just coincidentally at that time, then it looks like all 3 of these are satisfied, but you still don't know what time it is, right? And likewise for the no-got case, right, the 10 coins case, the sheep in the field. The sheep in the field's the easiest, I guess. I mean, you're riding around, right, out in the country, and you see something that you take to be a sheep. You have no reason for thinking that it's not that, and you form the belief, and it's true, and you're justified as we would ordinarily require. And it turns out it's not a sheep, it's a sheep statue or whatever, but off in the distance somewhere that you're not actually looking behind the barn or whatever. There is an actual sheep in the field. So it looks like again, you can concoct examples, some more exotic than others, that meet these 3 conditions, and yet the intuition of most folks upon reflection is that the person doesn't know, right? So you have a justified true belief, but you still don't know the proposition in question, and that shows those are counterexamples, right? So again, this methodology that I'm kind of making use of and running through quickly, it's new for some, it's more familiar to others, but stop me and ask me questions if any part of it doesn't quite click. So what that shows is you can satisfy these and yet not have knowledge, and the analysis says, well, wait, no, that's what knowledge is. This is like a definition, basically, a philosophical definition, an analysis of our ordinary concept of knows, right? So it looks like there's going to have to be a 4th condition here, right? This is the Gettier condition. whatever that turns out to be. Right? So initially, as we talked about a little last time, there were some attempts to try to save the traditional analysis by pointing out that these Gettier cases depend on two plausible principles, right? Anybody remember what they were? One of them? Yeah. Yeah, that you can be at least. Yeah, I mean, you're not justified in believing one that you have good reasons for believing is false, but yeah. So I mean, so the justified falsehood principle says that it's at least possible for a person to be justified in believing a proposition that turns out to be false, right? Now, if you reject that, and some people have this intuition, and that's okay, right? I mean, it's not a contest or a debate. It's just we're doing philosophy here. So you might think, well, wait, I mean, the people in the Gettier cases aren't justified in whatever that false proposition is in the very beginning, right? That they believe that they use to then infer the true proposition. If you reject the justified falsehood principle, then you can block the Gettier cases. They won't get off the ground. What's the problem with denying the justified falsehood principle, though? I mean, put simply, what's wrong with doing that? Why wouldn't we just say, okay, yeah, so those people aren't justified in those cases. End of story. Yeah. Yeah, so it looks like if you deny the justified falsehood principle, you end up having to get rid of the same evidence principle, and recall how that works, right? That says that if two people in two cases that are essentially alike, right, in all the relevant respects, have all the same evidence, then they're either both justified or they're both not justified, right, or justified in suspending, right? But it looks like you'd have to say, well, wait, we can construct examples where everything's exactly alike, the typical case and then the Gettier case, and the only difference is how they sort of arrive at it, right? They have the same evidence. So if you're justified in believing it when it turns out to be true, why wouldn't you be justified in believing it when it turns out to be false? That doesn't look like it's going to be good, especially since truth, again, is kind of, we're assuming the sort of correspondence theory, right? That truth isn't something we have immediate access to, right? That's beyond. Right? That's the whole point of getting evidence, is to try to get at the truth, to get closer to the truth. So it looks like giving up the justified falsehood principle would entail abandoning the same evidence principle, and that seems like a bad idea. And moreover, you can make the evidence that a person has for a proposition as strong as you want to make it, up to, right, you can't get to absolute certainty, we can't get to conclusive evidence, but we can make it anything short of that, in which case it's really, really hard to resist the intuition that, well, think about it. I mean, if you've got a 99% probability, and you know that's the probability, it seems like the right attitude for you to take is to believe the statement. I mean, what else should you do? Suspend judgment? That seems too conservative. So that's no good. The other approach is, anybody remember that one? What's the other principle that these things depend on? So there's the justified falsehood and had to do with closure. Yeah, justified deduction, right? What's the idea behind that? Anybody want to take a stab at it? Yeah, Jamie, thanks.
It's like, if a person is justified in believing P, and P entails Q, then they would be justified in also believing Q.
Thanks. Yeah, appreciate it. So we talked a little bit about closure principles and this idea that, knowledge or justification be closed under known entailment or implication. And that seems plausible again, right? I mean, it seems like a kind of regimented version of modus ponens. And so if you're justified in believing the conjunction P and P implies Q, and you come to believe Q on that basis, then it's really hard to see why you're not justified in believing Q, right? So once again, if you end up with some counterintuitive consequences. You end up being justified in believing the entailments of your true beliefs, but not your false beliefs, and you end up having to give up the same evidence principle again. So that's no good. Let me just pause for a second, see if anybody wants me to slow down or say more about any of that part, or are we kind of together? All right. So if we're not going to give up JF or JD, then it looks like we have to settle in with the fact that the JTB analysis is mistaken, right? Notice when I say that, what I'm saying, right? I'm not saying that you don't need those three things. I'm saying something different. I'm saying that you need those three things, but you need something else as well. They're not enough. So those are necessary conditions. Justified true belief is a set of necessary, though not sufficient, conditions for having knowledge. And so then one question is, okay, what do we have to add? What can we do as far as a fourth condition to kind of patch things up? And we considered a couple of proposals there, right? One early and one due to Michael Clark is this idea of there not being any false grounds, right? So all of S's grounds, and the grounds are supposed to be essentially like your reasons. So you have a justified true belief in the proposition, and all of your grounds for believing the proposition have to be true. And there is a temptation to think that, well, hey, look, in each of the initial, the Gettier cases, there's a falsehood lurking in the neighborhood, right, in the vicinity there. And maybe you can't have anything like that going on. And that's what keeps these cases from being cases of knowledge. And so then Feldman has this kind of elaborate discussion where he sort of shows that, well, some of it depends, right, on how you read a person's grounds. There's a kind of narrow interpretation and there's a wide interpretation. If you take the narrow interpretation, then Feldman's alternate route example seems like it gets around that, because it looks like you don't actually have to reason explicitly through a falsehood. There can just kind of be one lurking out there that's sort of part of your evidence, but it's not one of the explicit steps that you used in forming the belief, right? So that doesn't look like it's going to work, which suggests that Clark needs to use the broader, more comprehensive understanding of what one's grounds are, which is, the explicit steps along with anything else that kind of is doing any work in the background, implicit, tacit beliefs, background assumptions, and so on. But the problem there is that, that would block the alternate route case, keeps that from counting as knowledge, but then you get a whole new problem pops up, which is the extra reasons case. So, because there it looks like a person can have a whole bunch of reasons for thinking something's true. Some of them can be true, some of them can be false, and yet you can still know. So it doesn't look like either there's going to be an easy way to kind of make that work. That's about how far we got last time. There's questions about that much. Happy to say more. I think that it's, especially the discussion of no false grounds, I think is a good one, because as I said last time, it's kind of a model of, and these are hard insights to have. I can attest to that, but if you can come up with a situation where somebody's got a proposal and you can say, okay, well here's the concept in the theory or the proposal that's doing all the work, and it seems like it can be read in one of two ways or three ways, however many, but keep it kind of small, and then show what happens if you take it the first way, you get this new problem. If you take it the other way that they need to consider, you get a whole different problem. Then I think you've got a kind of good thing going there. So then that brings us to the second proposal. He only considers two ways of fixing it, right? Which is this idea of there not being any defeaters. So let me put that up, and we can take a look at that, and let's see what people think. So before I show this, anybody want to try to say what's the basic idea behind this no defeaters approach? Anybody remember? It's kind of a cool idea. It does seem to be kind of plausible, I think. Right? What would a defeater be? How would they play a role in keeping a person from knowing? I need that little Jeopardy clock that makes the sound. The sounds of silence.
There is no other truth that justification.
Yeah, thanks. Essentially, I mean, here's the basic idea. Appreciate it, Hannah. So, So the basic idea is that in each of these Gettier cases, seems like there's some true proposition out there, such that if the agent, if S were to become aware of it, he can spell this out in different ways, right? S becomes aware of it, or S gets justified in believing it, has reason for thinking that it's true, whatever, right? But there's some true proposition to that effect. If the person were to come to know that or believe that, then they'd no longer, right, be justified in believing whatever the target proposition is, the one that makes for trouble in these cases, right? These outside propositions, in effect, defeat the person's knowledge. So here's a way of kind of spelling out the initial idea. S knows P if and only if we get the first three conditions are satisfied, right? And then finally we add, there's no true proposition such that if S were justified in believing it, then S wouldn't be justified in believing the target proposition, P, right? So in other words, no truth out there defeats S's justification for believing P. So it's worthwhile. Whether we want to take the time to do it or not depends really on y'all. I mean, how much discussion we need. But you could try to go through each of those initial cases and explain, how would this work? And it looks like it can handle a lot of the cases, right? So to keep it simple, the clock on the wall, right? S believes that it's true, and S is justified in believing it based on the way S is appeared to by the clock, right? But there is a defeater for S's belief that it's that time, that he knows what time it is. Namely, the clock stopped 2 weeks ago, let's suppose. And so what that would mean is when you put it all together, in the stopped clock example, S wouldn't satisfy all four of these conditions. There is a truth, namely that the clock's broken, right? Such that if S were to come to be justified in believing that the clock were broken, S would no longer be justified in believing, I know what time it is, right? But you have to think about it a little bit. So I'm happy to pause for a second and see if people want to ask questions about how it works. So the no-defeaters approach, Keith Lear is one of and Tom Paxson were some of the early advocates for this, and it does have appeal. I kind of like the idea, but it seems like it's open to some of its own challenges. Now, this first example that Feldman gives, the radio case, is confusing, kind of hard to understand, and it may be worth taking a minute to have one of you guys read us the case. So who wants to read? Let's find it first. It is over on this example 3.6 on 34. Anybody want to read it for us? It's just easier, that way we were all on the same page and we hear it at the same time. Yeah, thanks, Ian.
Example 3.6, the radio case. Smith is sitting in his study with his radio off, and Smith knows that it's off. At the time, Classic Hits 101 is playing the great Neil Diamond's great song, Girl, You'll Be a Winning Soon. If Smith had the radio on and he tuned to that station, Smith would hear the song and know that it was on.
Yeah. So then it goes on, right?
It may not be immediately obvious why this poses a problem, but it does. In example 3.6, Smith knows A, the radio is off. Conditions 1 through 3 of the TAK are satisfied. Is I be satisfied? That is there any true proposition such that if Smith were justified in believing it, then he would not be justified in believing A? One true proposition in the story is 9 Classic Hits 101 is now playing the Girl Who Wants to Sing.
Thanks. Yeah, so as he says, this is kind of a tough example. Anybody see, and again, I've said this before, but with all of what Feldman's doing in here, it's worth reading it 2-3 times or more, right? Because there's not a lot of reading, but it's kind of terse, and you got to think about it. So Smith's sitting in his office, right, and he looks at the radio and he sees it. He knows that the radio's off, right? He knows that one. How does the fact that Classic Hits 101's playing that Neil Diamond song make trouble? Yeah, Anthony.
I think he knew that it was playing, and he would either have the radio on. I think
Yeah.
he mentions that we're going at it some point in text.
Yeah. So there are different ways you could come to know that that song's playing, but let's suppose that, and again, some of this involves some tough stuff about different kinds of conditionals, but one obvious, so the most maybe logical way or plausible way in which you'd come to know that that song's playing is you'd have the radio on, right? In which case you'd no longer be justified in believing the radio's off. So it looks like there is a true statement out there such that if Smith were justified in believing it, he'd no longer be justified in believing the target proposition, right? Nevertheless, in this case, Smith knows the radio's off because he's looking at it, right? So this isn't good. Now, I'll say something about conditionals here in just a little bit. Well, actually, this is a pretty good time because he's going to talk about the Tom Gravitt case. So let me find So some stuff about conditionals and defeaters here. Everybody remembers conditionals, at least the vast majority of people here have had logic, 310, or practical reasoning, 115. So a conditional, right? There are a bunch of different kinds of conditionals. It's an if-then statement. It gets represented in lots of different ways, often with the arrow, sometimes with the horseshoe, right? And some conditionals are difficult to evaluate. So if you remember the truth table for the material conditional, right? Anytime and just again, to make sure we're all on the same page background-wise. So we've got a conditional here, P, arrow Q, right? This is the antecedent, if P, then Q. So this is the antecedent, and this is the consequent, right? And you remember the truth table for this, at least for what they call the material conditional, right? The arrow in logic, right? How that goes. So we got P and we got Q here. True, false, true, and false. These are the assignments. These are the truth values, right? One thing we know for sure is that if the antecedent's true and the consequent is false, then the arrow is false in that case, right? If P is true and Q is true, then the arrow, of course, is true. Breaking chalk. But down here, we've got a false antecedent in each case, right? And we've got a true consequent and a false consequent. What do we do? Anybody remember from logic? How do those go? They're still true. Yeah. And this is the truth table for what they call the material conditional. And as I say, in the philosophy of language, there's a voluminous literature on conditionals because there's lots of different kinds of them, and there's a lot of discussion, always has been, about the extent to which this kind of conditional is even close as a reflection of ordinary English conditionals, right? A lot of people, not people that haven't been exposed to logic, find this kind of unintuitive. Why would it be that when the antecedent is false, we still say that the arrow is true, right? That seems kind of puzzling to a lot of people. Now notice that there are other kinds of conditionals. So the indicative conditional is sort of the simplest one, I guess. If P is true, then Q is true. And there'll be debate over whether or not indicative conditionals can be very well captured by the arrow. But, so here's an example. If the ball hits the glass, then the glass will break. But there are also subjunctive conditionals. If you've taken foreign language, which most of you have, maybe everybody, then you remember the subjunctive mood, having to learn the subjunctive, right? If P were true, then Q would be true. So if the ball were to hit the glass, then the glass would break. Right? And then counterfactual conditionals, right? If P had been the case, then Q would have been the case. been a lot of discussion in philosophy of language and in metaphysics about the truth conditions for counterfactual conditionals, because those are conditionals are sometimes called contrary to fact conditionals, where we know the antecedent is false, right? And we know that for the arrow at least, whenever the if part, the if clause is false, that we accord the entire connective the value true. But that doesn't seem to be a very good way of rendering counterfactual conditionals, especially since, at least in a lot of cases, say in the philosophy of science, if you're doing work on laws of nature, you might think that one of the things that backs up a law of nature is that it supports counterfactuals, right? So if I were to release the chalk from my fingers right now, it would fall to the ground, right? It's a law of nature that makes that the case, right? Law of universal gravitation, whatever. And so you might think that's, now if I don't do it, right, it's still true. The law of nature holds, even though I never tested it. If I had released it, it would have done that. The antecedent's false, but nevertheless, right? Now that's one where, okay, it seems plausible. But if I say something like, well, if I had released the chalk, then it would have floated to the ceiling, and I didn't release the chalk, right? It's still going to turn out to be true if you use this way of rendering the counterfactual. So clearly, they present puzzles, how to understand contrary to fact conditionals, because some seem really plausible and some don't, right? If Kennedy hadn't been assassinated, he would have gone on to a second term. That seems like a pretty plausible, maybe counterfactual. If Kennedy hadn't been assassinated, then, the moon is made of green cheese, or would have been, whatever. Come up with some crazy consequence. Not at all plausible. Nevertheless, since they're both counterfactuals, if you use this, they both turn out to be true. So that's no good. So you have to come up with some different way of handling them. Subjunctive conditionals likewise present a kind of puzzle. And these defeater theories are typically cashed out in terms of the subjunctive type conditional, right? That there not be any truth out there such that if the person were to become aware of it and get justified in believing it, they'd no longer be justified in believing the target proposition. How are we going to understand these subjunctive conditionals? Presents a kind of puzzle. That's part of what's going on in the radio case, right? As Anthony points out, and Feldman notes, different ways in which the person could come to be justified in believing that song is playing. Somebody could text it to them, in which case the radio could still be off. So there's a little bit of not an ambiguity, but some fuzziness there at least. As far as these counterfactual conditionals, what people often do to evaluate them is they talk in terms of possible worlds. They call it possible world semantics. So the idea is that we imagine, and David Lewis and Saul Kripke are two people who have done a lot of work. Lewis is deceased, but Saul Kripke's still around. We imagine that here's the actual world, and at varying distances from the actual world is a space of possible worlds. Now again, a lot of work's been done by people in metaphysics debating what exactly these entities are, right? But one thing's pretty clear. For the vast majority of folks, talk of possible worlds is just simply a useful way of speaking. It's just a kind of handy heuristic device. It's not, we could do all the work we want to do without really having to take on the metaphysics of these things and worry about, oh geez, so now I got to believe in these, I got the actual world and I got to believe in these possible worlds. It seems like a kind of bloated ontology. That said, has been a lot of interest in exactly how to construct these possible worlds, right? But the basic idea is that we've got the actual world, and at varying distances from it, we've got what we'll call possible worlds. You can think of them as ways things might have been. So some are going to be just a little bit different from the way things actually are. So imagine a world that's exactly like this world, except there's one less atom, right? Or one less quark or whatever. That's a world. It's a possible world. Imagine a world that's exactly like this world where somebody who is a student in this class that's not here today came to class. Suppose Corey's here, right? That's a possible world, right? that's one that's a little further away than the one where there's just one more or one less atom, and so on, all the way out to these more distant worlds where maybe you have completely different laws of nature, worlds where there aren't any people at all, or where, whatever, where the Earth doesn't exist. So in any case, what we then do is we take the antecedent of one of these counterfactual conditionals, right? So if Kennedy hadn't been assassinated, you go to the nearest world where that antecedent is true, where Kennedy's not assassinated, and you look, quote unquote, into that world to see whether or not the consequent is true. If it is, then we say that counterfactual is true. That's the idea, at least, roughly, behind this sort of approach. And it's gained a lot of traction, again, despite debate over exactly what these things are supposed to be. And if you're interested in that, let me know, and I can put you onto some different sources to take a look at. The logic of all of this is kind of fascinating for people who like logic, too. It's been worked out pretty extensively, mostly by David Lewis. He's one of the pioneers of this idea in his book, Counterfactuals. So, in any case, good to at least be aware of the different kinds of conditionals and have some basic understanding of how they play into the no-defeaters approach, right? The idea that if the person were subjunctively to come to be aware of some proposition. So in the nearest world where Smith, knows or is justified in believing that song is playing on the radio, presumably that's the one where the radio is on in his office on the desk, and so he's no longer justified, obviously, in believing that the radio is off. That's the idea. But I agree, the example can be confusing, so hopefully that helps a little bit. What about the grab it case, 3.7, bottom half of 35? Anybody want to read that one for us? It's worth talking a little bit, too, because it presents another kind of puzzle. Yeah, I think so. Appreciate it.
Well, I see your student Tom grabs Dick Cave in his book pocket and sneak out of the library. She knows that Tom's asleep. Now imagine that Tom's crime is reported to Tom's mother at the relevant psychiatric hospital. When she replies that Tom didn't do it, that it was his twin brother Tim. And imagine further that he has no twin brothers. It's just another one of her delusions. Black is ignorant of all this. Why is this a problem? Consider this true. Tom's mother said that Tom's twin Tim didn't take. Notice that Tim itself is true, even though what Tom's mother said is false. If Black were justified in believing just this truth, but not the rest of the story all about her, that would defeat Black's justification. It is a misleading belief. Again, this may seem confusing, but the idea is relatively simple. If we can know ordinary things, then there can be other truths such that if we learned them, it would undermine our justification for the thing we know.
Right. Thanks. Yeah, no, that's good. I appreciate things here. So, again, this is kind of a puzzling case, right? People see how it's supposed to work, what the problem is there. So, there can be misleading defeaters, right? That would undermine your knowledge, and in a sense, you're lucky not to know them. So these are cases where you really do have knowledge. Nevertheless, there's something out there that if you were justified in believing it, you'd no longer be justified in believing the target proposition, but you're lucky not to know those things. And here's a worry, right? I mean, there's a lot we're probably lucky not to know, in part because it would be misleading, right? So, again, it's confusing. We do know these things, right? And so any account of what's going to fix the Gettier problem is going to have to not take away knowledge that we're really confident that we have. It's a kind of a problem, right? It's got to be just right. It's got to get all and only those cases that we have firm intuitions or cases of knowledge. It can't be so narrow as to leave out anything and allow for the Gettier problem to creep back in, but it can't be so broad as to undermine things that we do know, and it's certainly not because of these misleading kinds of statements, right? So Feldman doesn't solve the Gettier problem here, right? He has a kind of modest proposal. Let's see if I can find that one for us here and show you. There it There it is. So this is Feldman's idea at the end of the chapter. This is the no essential falsehoods. And again, it's not meant to be a solution to the Gettier problem, and he realizes that. It's a kind of acknowledgement that it's a real problem, and that getting it diagnosed properly and solved isn't going to be easy. So we've got the initial three conditions, right? JTB, and then something roughly like S's justification doesn't essentially depend on any kind of falsehood, right? But we have to unpack this idea of essential dependence, because we've seen that you can have falsehoods among your grounds and still have knowledge, right? And we've seen that you can have knowledge despite the fact there are things out there that were you to come to know them or be justified in believing them, right? You would no longer have that knowledge, but those things are misleading. We don't want those kinds of defeaters to keep us from knowing, right? So no solution to the Gettier problem at the end of chapter 3, but at least a modest proposal. And so that's the end of that. Questions? I'm happy to go back if we have to points that people are still not completely clear on. People feel reasonably good about this much? Pretty good? All right. So let me move us on then, make a little progress into chapter 4, which is all about evidentialist accounts. And it's, as Anthony says, it's a long chapter. So best to kind of take it in chunks. And I probably won't even get to foundationalism until next time. That's where I'm headed. So in the same way that we started off in chapter 3 analyzing knowledge, we can do the same thing for justification. And you can see, right, S is justified in believing P if and only if what, right? So of the, setting aside the Gettier condition, right, which is its own can of worms, of the other three conditions, we've got the truth condition, the belief condition, and the justification condition. The truth condition, we've talked about the correspondence theory of truth. It's sort of the traditional go-to approach. Obviously, there are people that reject it. It's come under criticism, from various quarters, and will always will, I suspect. But in any case, the thing about the correspondence theory of truth is that it makes truth external, right? So there's nothing specifically epistemic about the truth condition. That's not to say that there aren't a lot of questions about whether the correspondence theory can be defended from various sorts of objections. So you set aside the truth condition. The belief condition, right, the second condition, again, I'm not suggesting that there aren't some really hard, interesting philosophical questions about belief. There are. But they're not specifically epistemic in nature, right? They're questions in the philosophy of mind or philosophy of psychology, questions for people in cognitive science, neuroscience, AI perhaps, about the nature of belief. What does it take to have a belief? What about beliefs that are maybe non-conceptual in nature? Do you have to have a certain stock of concepts or a certain kind of conceptual scheme to be able to even have propositional knowledge, and so on? But those are, again, questions that aren't specifically epistemic. So if you get rid of the truth condition, you get rid of the belief condition, and the Gettier, set aside the fourth condition, because that's going to involve somehow diagnosing and figuring out what's going wrong in those Gettier cases, and it seems like there's a disconnection between the truth condition and the justification condition, which means the fourth condition, whatever it is, it's going to have to be some sort of external making condition, something that connects those two. Setting all that aside, the only thing you're left with is the justification condition, and that's where most of the action has been since the Gettier problem, trying to figure out and analyze this core concept of epistemic justification. So we're back to now just doing the same thing over again, in effect. S is justified in believing P if and only if what? Well, so what is this idea of justification? Now, some of this we've talked a little bit about at different times in the past, but it won't hurt to give people a little bit of a rerun and give you a chance to ask questions. Boy, that sure is hard to see. Can you make it a little better? Is that better? Okay. So, to the initial question then, what does it say that S is justified in believing P? The analogy that I've used, and again, there are things you can say about these analogies, but they're helpful up to a point, is that think of it as being comparable to what one ought to believe. So in moral philosophy, in ethics, right? How many people, just show of hands, have taken a course here at USCG in ethics, of some sort of ethics? Really? Nobody? No more people? Oh. I'm surprised. I figured everybody had taken at least a handful of applied ethics courses here because we've got quite a number of them. So, okay, maybe this will be more helpful than I thought. So, in moral philosophy and ethics, right, we make use of this idea of what you ought to do. Talk about moral obligation, right? So, if you borrow $100 from a family member and you say, hey, can I borrow $100? I promise to pay you back. Give them a date, right? To pay them back. And the time comes and you don't pay them back, you've broken your promise, right? An intuition that a lot of folks would have, not everybody maybe, but a lot of folks is that that's morally wrong. You violated a kind of moral requirement, because when you give your word, right, in good faith that you're going to do something, that's an act of making a promise. And you ought to keep your promises in general. So, in that kind of an example, you've fallen short of that, and what you've done is morally wrong. Again, you can kind of pick your examples, and there'll be some variation in intuitions, I'm sure. I try to stick with stuff that's pretty straightforward. I think most folks would say in a case of non-defective promise making, you ought to keep your promise. Are there going to be cases where your moral obligation to keep a promise can be overridden by other considerations? Sure. I mean, I'm not saying that these, if you've made a promise to the kingpin, to the mob boss, to perform a murder for hire, that's a promise you shouldn't keep, right? Better to break that one. So that might be just a case of defective promising or whatever, right? But the analogy with moral obligation and epistemic obligation can be kind of useful here. And I think a lot of, at least for Feldman, I know he goes to that because in general I think people are maybe less skeptical about the notion of moral obligation. Again, there's some hand waving here because you can find bright folks that are skeptical about just about any of these things, but we do have an entire area of philosophy, right, ethics, that's concerned with nature of right and wrong. And certainly normative ethics is the branch of ethics that's focused on understanding and unpacking the concept of what you morally ought to do, right? So if you kind of buy that analogy, Feldman's got some examples here, right? We could say that a person's belief is to evaluate a person's belief, right? To say that it's justified is to evaluate it in a certain way. So these are evaluative notions, right? In the same way that when we say that Smith ought to pay back the loan, or that Jones ought to keep her promise, right? These are moral evaluations, so they have a normative dimension to them. Same kind of thing with epistemic justification. So in the same way that there's moral obligation, we can think about epistemic obligation as your obligations vis-a-vis what you ought to believe, right? So in one case, in the case of ethics, we're talking about how you ought to act. We're evaluating your behavior, presumably from. And again, when we talk about obligation in terms of how you ought to act, there are going to be different senses. And this is where the analogy, I think, is particularly helpful, because we can talk about your moral obligations, we can talk about your legal obligations, your financial obligations, right? Your obligations vis-a-vis your self-interest. What should you do from the standpoint of your rational self-interest? What's going to benefit you the most, right? So there's going to be multiple senses of obligation when it comes to action. And what Feldman tries to do is sort of piggyback on that strategy and say, well, the same thing, we can defend the idea that that's true in the case of belief as well. Not only can we talk about what you ought to do, but we can talk about what you ought to believe, and there's going to be these different senses, right? So, to the question, what makes epistemic evaluations true? Presumably, because these epistemic obligations, like moral obligations, are evaluative in nature, the concepts are normative concepts, the answer is going to be some sort of supervenience. So let me say a little bit about supervenience. It's a term that I don't expect people to be familiar with. So there's been a lot written about it in the literature over the years. A number of different authors have discussed it. So the idea behind supervenience is that we imagine sort of two levels. We've got, let's say, I'll put them up higher here. We've got some high-level properties. Let's call this the A level. And then we've got some lower-level properties. I'll call this the B level for base. All right. So these higher-level properties are in effect determined by the lower-level properties. They're not reducible to the lower level, but they're generated by this lower level. Is the basic idea. So when we say that, and these upper level properties are things like being obligated to believe something, right? Or a proposition's being justified for a person at a time. What makes it the case that you're justified in believing something? Well, presumably justification, since it's an evaluative concept, a normative notion, it has to be unpacked in terms of some more basic, purely descriptive level properties. Feldman gives this kind of example that I think is useful involving the students in the two papers. Anybody remember how that worked? That makes it a little bit easier to follow. So suppose we have a paper in this course. So you've got a paper at the end of the semester you've got to write, right? Suppose I get two papers from two people in this class. And without them having kind of conspired, as I'm reading them, I come to realize that they're exactly the same. I mean, literally, like word for word, sentence for sentence, letter for letter, right? Punctuation mark for punctuation mark, exactly the same. Now, ordinarily, of course, at that point, something's gone wrong. We know that there's been a violation of the honor code. But set that aside. Let's just suppose that by pure happenstance, two people in this class wrote exactly the same, literally the same paper, but the same kind of paper in terms of all these details, right? And I've got to grade these papers. And so I take the first one and I read it, and I say, this is an excellent paper, and its grade it's an A-. That's the grade. Now, a paper's having a grade of A- or being an A paper, A- paper, again, that's an evaluation. I'm appraising, I'm rating, I'm assessing, right, the paper in terms of whatever the rubric is. The actual details that make up the paper, like the grammatical aspects of the paper, the sentences, the punctuation, the citations, all of that stuff, right? That's all just purely descriptive level stuff, right? Nothing evaluative going on there. So I read the first one, I say it's an A-, and then some time passes, and I get the second one, and I read it, and I say, no, this is a C+. So one's an A- and one's a C+. I give the papers back to the students, and as students are apt to do, they compare notes. And to their surprise, right, their shock and dismay, they've actually each written the same paper. Now again, by same, I don't mean literally numerically identical. There's two papers there, not one paper, but the same kind of paper, the same paper in the relevant respects. All the physical aspects of the paper are the same. And one's an A- and one's a C+. So the students are upset, right? And they come to me and they say, Rick, what's going on here? As fate would have it, our papers are the same, but you say this one's an A- and this one's a C+. How can that be? It would be really weird for me to say, yep, just the way they are. This is an A minus. This is a C plus. I mean, that students would have a right to be outraged at that point, right? Something's gone wrong. Why is that? Well, because presumably you have it in your mind that what makes one an A minus and one a C plus has to be somehow tied to facts about the paper. And if the relevant facts are the same in the two cases, then they should get the same grade. They should either both be A minuses or both be C pluses. To say that that's not the case would be a violation of this idea of supervenience, the idea that these base level features are what determine these higher level features. Now, this notion of supervenience has gotten a lot of use in many areas of philosophy. In metaphysics, especially in the philosophy of mind, a lot of folks talk about mental properties supervening on purely physical states of the brain. So if you think that what it is to be in a certain mental state is ultimately determined by a certain kind of neurological state. Take normal human beings at least, right? So there's all these brain states that your brain gets into, neurological states, right? And we don't have to know what they are. We don't, right? We're not doing neuroscience here. But it's going to be some complicated electrochemical state of your brain described in the language of neuroscience, right? So there's going to be circuitry and electrical activity and various chemical reactions taking place, right? All of that stuff's going to be happening here at the base level, at the level of just neurologic description. If you think, though, that somehow the story about what psychological states the person's experiencing has to be explained in terms of this lower level of activity, then probably you think that the psychological supervenes on the physical. They call this a psychophysical supervenience thesis, right? The idea, and people who have this kind of view are often referred to as property dualist because they believe in two levels of properties. There's a high level of properties, namely the psychological properties, that are determined by this lower level. And lower doesn't mean worse, it's just lower in terms of explanatory capacity, right? You're explaining these properties, these psychological states, like thinking a certain thought right now or experiencing a certain sensation, in terms of some lower level states. But again, we're not saying that we can reduce the higher level to the lower level, right? Only that the higher level is determined by the lower level. So what is that determination principle? Well, here's the idea. Feldman's got it. One property supervenes on another just in case it's impossible for two objects to be exactly alike with respect to the lower level ones, right? But differ with respect to the higher level ones, right? So we say that he uses F and G. We'd say that A supervenes on B just in case any two objects that are exactly alike at the B level are exactly alike at the A level. Couldn't be any difference at the higher order without a difference somehow in the lower level. And again, he articulates this epistemic supervenience principle. So if two beliefs are exactly alike in the non-epistemic respects, then they have to be exactly alike at the higher level in terms of their justificatory status. Either they're both justified or neither is justified, or they're both ones that deserve being suspended about, justified to the same degree. So what are these non-epistemic facts that we're talking about here? And this gets important because we'll see later, there's been a debate going on for a while, certainly maybe since the 80s, first period comes to mind, between a group known as internalist and a group known as externalist. And we'll see some externalist theories in Chapter 5, right, over how to understand the justification condition. Some people want to understand it in terms of evidence, people like Feldman, Connie, others. And other folks want to understand it non-evidentially. So Chapter 5 is about non-evidential theories of justification. What would these base-level facts, these B-level things, be in the case of justification? Well, he gives a bunch of different ones, right? The causes of one's belief. So what it is that's causing you to have the belief in question. In general, you may or may not have access to that fact. You may not know, right? At some level, what's causing it are precursor neurological states. Limiting myself here to talking about human beings' beliefs. Whether the belief is true. That's a non-epistemic fact, right? It's a non-evaluative fact. The extent to which other people might believe the same thing, right? The agent's experiences, and what other beliefs the agents have, or the agent has. All of these are going to be things that can be packed into the base level. And of course, the big question, or one of the big questions, is what are the relevant features down here? What should be put in at the base level that makes for justification, makes for the epistemic status that a belief has at the higher level? Different theorists are going to give different answers to the question. One answer, the one that we're going to be considering for now at least, is this idea that evidentialism has, which is that it's one's evidence that ultimately determines the epistemic status. So I'll just put this up here. Epistemic status. And then down here, evidence. All right. You see where this is going, right? So we say that the epistemic status of a belief supervenes on the evidence that a person has for the belief. What that means is that any two people who have exactly the same evidence should have exactly the same beliefs justified for them, not justified for them, or ones to which they should suspend judgment. Right? In other words, that evidence is what makes for the difference. Now, you may say, I can go with the idea that evidence is an important part of the story, but it's not the whole story. Couldn't there be other things that are important? If you do that, and that's an option for you, then that's not evidentialism. Right? That's a different view. So how to formulate. Let me just stop for a second and see if people want to ask questions about supervenience. I'm happy to try to say more. It's a kind of mysterious concept. I mean, it can have that feel to it. And I'm not saying that it's unproblematic. It's not. But at some level, it gets used in more than just epistemology. It gets used in metaphysics. Right? It gets used in philosophy of mind. You can think about it even in aesthetics. Right? Any two physical and you may say, well, look, there, things seem to go wrong. Consider the Michelangelo's statue, David, right? Suppose you had an exact duplicate of David. It was like I mean, we can't really do this, right? But imagine twin Earth. It's a twin Earth scenario, and we've got David here on Earth, the real McCoy, and then on twin Earth we've got an exact duplicate of David, right? It's a molecule for molecule replica of the thing, whatever. So physically speaking, in terms of all of the sort of observable properties, right, they're going to be exactly alike. Nevertheless, the one is a priceless art object, the one created by Michelangelo, right? The other one is a fake. You can do this for any kind of artwork. Why is that? Well, because whether or not something has the aesthetic property of being a great work of art, right, depends not just on its physical properties. It depends in part on its causal ancestry. It depends in part on who the artist was that created it, or did the right artist create it. Is it a copy? There are fantastic copyists out there, right? That can copy paintings. There are forgers. And some of them are really, really good. I mean, some of the world's great experts in art identification could be stumped by how good some of these art forgers are. Nevertheless, you wouldn't want to spend, $25 million on a fake Picasso. You'd be really bummed out to find out when you take it to Christie's, right, or Sotheby's or whatever. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Smith, this is a fake. You got a counterfeit. You'd be really upset, and rightfully so. So, in a case of whether or not something's an art object has the relevant aesthetic status, that would seem to depend on more than just the physical properties of the thing. It's going to have so the supervenience base is going to be different. It's going to include those physical properties, but any two objects that are exactly alike with respect to those aren't going to be exactly alike with respect to whether they're art objects, unless you throw in the origin, the provenance of the piece in question. There are a lot of examples like that. So sometimes there can be violations of supervenience, and there's also going to be debate about what gets included or what ought to be included in this lower level here. But for now, questions about supervenience, happy to say more. All right. So formulating evidentialism. How do we do that? Well, here's the basic idea. We've sort of seen this before. Believing, disbelieving, suspending, right, is justified for a person at a time if and only if the person's evidence at that time supports it, right, or goes against it, or is completely neutral with respect to it. And I've talked about the difference between total evidence and conclusive evidence. Bear that in mind, right? So we're talking here, it'll come out, and Feldman talks a little bit about it, but the requirement is the total evidence requirement, right? And you get your total evidence by taking all of the evidence for thinking that the proposition is not true and subtracting it figuratively from all the evidence for thinking that it is true. You're going to get that weighting. That's where you get the kind of seesaw thing, right? The total evidence requirement here, though, is that you have to take into consideration when you're trying to decide whether or not, or what evidence, when you're understanding evidentialism, what it says is that it's your total evidence that's relevant, not just a portion of the evidence, right? So for any complex claim, chances are there's going to be reasons for thinking that it's true, and there are going to be reasons for thinking that it's not true, right? If you just focused on one or the other, right, you just sort of cherry-picked out the parts you liked, you're not going to be complying with evidentialism. That's not what it says, right? So some different things to keep in mind about this initial formulation of evidentialism. That the doxastic attitudes, right, are the objects of epistemic evaluation here. So we're talking about beliefs. Talked about this before. We're not talking about other propositional attitudes, right? Your evidence, what is it? Again, there can be debate, but one way of thinking about it is it's all the information that the agent has available at the time. Now, again, information is being understood in this kind of internalistic way, right? By information, I'm not talking about what the causal ancestry of the belief. I'm not talking about facts about the reliability of the process that led to the belief. I'm not talking about the extent to which that belief tracks the truth under various kinds of counterfactual situations. All of those proposals are going to, I'm not talking about the probability that the belief is true. These are all things that are beyond the level of agent information awareness, right? It's not stuff you're aware of in general about any of your beliefs right now. What you're aware of are the beliefs you've got, the ones that you're currently thinking about, right? Or that I can prompt, that I can call to mind for you by saying, consider your belief that, you're right next to whatever building it is, Ferguson. It's true, and you believed it before I called that out, but now you're thinking about it. So I can get you to sort of consider other beliefs that you've got among your background information, right? So there's that stock of beliefs as well as the experiences that you're currently having. Right? But again, I'm understanding experience. Feldman's understanding it this way as well. The neurological events that maybe either are or that make up your current level of awareness, conscious awareness, that's not part of your information in the relevant sense. And there's a puzzle here, right? Because how could it, if those events are in fact the states in question, then it looks like you're going to get into trouble. It looks like you recognize them from one point of view, but not from another. You recognize the conscious experience that you're having right now, but you don't recognize the neurological states, qua-neurological states, that are either causing it or that are, in fact, those states. That's a puzzle. And again, actual evidence versus the perceived evidential support. What evidentialism requires is that the proposition be supported by your actual evidence, not just what you think is your evidence. That creates an additional possibility of a mismatch, right? People can misevaluate their evidence, right? Another thing that I need to say something about here, and Feldman discusses this, he talks about this idea of well-founded belief versus justified belief, right? So this language gets used in different ways. Here are some expressions that are all supposed to be the same. We can say that S is justified in believing that P, that believing P is justified for S, or that S has justification for P. Those are all kind of the same, using those synonymously, right? Whereas S's belief that P is justified, S's belief in P is well-founded, or S justifiably believes P, these imply something different. Hopefully people see the difference. The former don't imply the latter. In other words, we can talk about what Mary's justified in believing about her situation without imputing any beliefs to Mary. Right? We can say that, well, what she ought to believe is blah, 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 whether she believes it or not. Right? That seems, again, hopefully that doesn't throw people off, but the core concept is this one right here, the idea of what you're epistemically justified in believing, whether you go on to form the belief or not. All right? So the second sort of round of description here implies that the belief has in fact been formed. All right? Okay. So on to another aspect of evidentialism that we should think a little bit about here. So William Clifford has this famous paper where he says that it's wrong. This is a quote that gets trotted out quite a bit. It's wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. Right? And so then the question comes up, is that true in general? Is it wrong for a person to believe something on insufficient evidence? And Feldman discusses a couple of examples here, right? We've got this chest pains example, and we've got the optimistic batter, right? And then we've got the recovery example. In the interest of time, I won't take us through reading each of those, but if you've read it, and I hope you have, then you remember, I hope, how they work, right? So what's the basic idea behind chest pains? Well, you start having some mild chest pains, right? And you decide to go to the doctor to check it out. You think you might be having a heart attack. What should you believe and what should you do? Well, Feldman's way of dealing with that kind of case is to say, well, look, we've got to always be mindful of the difference between what you're justified in believing and what you're justified in doing, right? So those are different things. When we're talking about what you're justified in doing, we're talking about what you ought to do from the standpoint of behavior, right? Practical action. When we talk about belief, we're talking about whether or not it would be the right thing for you to believe from the standpoint of trying to get at the truth, right? Trying to come to know some proposition. And although you're not justified in believing that you're having a heart attack, suppose that you're only having some mild pain and you just had a giant meal of really spicy food, and you also have bad gastric reflux or something, right? There are a lot of things that can simulate, cause chest pain. Right? It would seem to be, kind of a hasty thing to conclude that you must be having a heart attack under those conditions. Maybe you're not justified from the standpoint of your total evidence in believing that proposition, that I'm in the midst of having a heart attack. But certainly, out of an abundance of caution, you might be justified in doing something, namely getting it checked out, right? Better safe than sorry in a case like that. What about the optimistic batter? How does that one work? Well, you've got a person here who is getting ready to bat, and the person's considering the proposition, I'll get a hit, right? But I think let's suppose that as background information, the person also knows that even really, really successful players rarely bat 500, right? Most of the time you don't get a hit. So you're getting ready to go, you're stepping up to the plate. What should you believe? Well, your total evidence would seem to suggest that you should believe that probably you won't get a hit. But we also know that that's not the way you want to go into it, right? People who have that would be much better to be slightly overconfident in this particular situation, because again, there's something that you're trying to accomplish. You're trying to get a hit, and being slightly optimistic is going to probably improve your chances, right? So again, these examples are kind of designed to tear at your intuitions. If you're of two minds about them, and you think, well, I kind of see why somebody might be tempted to believe this, or why somebody might say it's the right thing for somebody to do to have this belief, even though their evidence doesn't support it, then it's working. Then the examples are working, right? So, but once again, we have to make a distinction here, and Feldman tries to do that between, what you're justified in believing from the epistemic point of view as opposed to what you justified in believing from, the practical point of view. Right? What you should believe, practically speaking, is whatever's going to enhance, help you achieve your goal, going to be in your self-interest, whereas what you're justified in believing from the epistemic point of view is what's supported by your total evidence at the time. All right. Well, I'll stop with that for now and pick back up with the last little bit of this next time. The goal for next time is to get as far into foundationalism as we can. So if you've read it, sorry we didn't get to it, but reread it. It's worth rereading for next time. Thanks, folks. See if it stopped.